Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, and this is our live Liberty Alert. I'm the Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, and we're in Washington, D.C., and out there with you, too, learning how to put our temporal liberties to work for the sake of proclaiming the eternal liberties of Christ without fear or government coercion. And unfortunately, we have to contend for these things in ways that we probably didn't have to do 40 or 50 years ago. But again, contending for these things is part of our First Amendment responsibilities. It's a privilege that we have those responsibilities here in this country, so we aim to put them to work. Today, we're going to talk about, we talked about secular pietism last time, and we talked about kind of what it is. And that really is the challenge that we're up against, the secularization of our culture, as if the Christian worldview is antithetical to freedom and liberty, and somehow the secular worldview can replace it. And it can't. And one of the things I say to people all the time, if the Christian worldview gives way in America, and it could, it's virtually absent in our school system now. In fact, it's antagonistically spoken against in our school system. If that gives way, your liberties go with it, because your liberties are founded in the fact that there's a voice outside of government that says that you have dignity, that you have rights, and you have freedoms. Once they debunk that, then the coercive power of the state is the only arbiter of your freedoms. Well, we've seen how that works. The last 100 years was the last 100 years in the 20th century was the time of the secular state. We saw it all over the world, and individual people disappear. Only governments, only secular elites. Those are the only people on the world stage. Well, America still, what makes America unique is, and we'll talk about again, the uniqueness of it is that it opens up this third group of people. I would call them the middle class, the mom and pop store, the people who actually just want to take care of their families, and they want a government to provide basic stuff so that they can get about their own way of living their lives faithfully to their families and their neighborhoods and their churches. That's a unique thing still, that third group of people. And they're all races, creeds, and colors in that third group of people, and that's a good thing. All right, again, thanks again for sharing these Liberty Alerts. I know that you guys are checking in with us all the time, and appreciate that. But I really do appreciate you sharing this. That's the best thing that's happening for our Liberty Alerts, is that you're taking these things and you're sharing these things and you're using these as opportunities about how to talk to other church folks about how to deal with a lot of these issues. And that's what we try to provide here for you. So we can't do this without you. And by the way, if you feel compelled, I know it's in the middle of the pandemic, we're all kind of struggling through things, but if you feel compelled to donate to us and keep us in your prayers as well, please go ahead and do that. We can't do this again without you. All right, today, the violence unfortunately continues. The lawlessness in our cities. And again, we've been talking about some of that, but the main point of government is to actually tamp down our worst human impulses and keep relative peace, relative justice at work in all of our communities. And so again, this idea of ensuring law and order, equal justice under the law, and undergirding people's individual rights, that's what they're supposed to do. And that's not what we're seeing. So state and local governments are failing all over the country, and again, for this most basic task. We've got to challenge those in leadership to do the one thing that we've kind of voted them in to do. And again, those kind of things, they're being sidetracked. To give you an example, a poll came out this week, said 4 out of 5 black Americans, listen to this, 4 out of 5 black Americans want the same number of police or more police in their neighborhoods for the sake of their neighborhood. And of course that stands to reason. They want what everybody wants. They want safe neighborhoods. They want to raise intact families. Law-abiding black folks want what everybody else wants, and that's peace, to care for their own on their own terms. I mean, I'm just saying, but that's, you know, if you want to know other resources for what black folks think other than celebrities or liberal pundits, Larry Elder's got a documentary out. It's called Uncle Tom, and you really do need to see that. You need to know names like Thomas Sowell, Walt Williams, Clarence Thomas, Ben Carson, and then especially Robert Woodson. You got to know that there's a thing called the 1776 Project. It's competing with the nonsensical 1619 Project, which literally makes the statement that the War of Independence was fought for slavery. That's nonsensical. It's unhistorical. It's non-historical. So again, the 1776 Project by Robert Woodson, African American historians, entrepreneurs, that's who's putting this together. You need to see that. You need to view that. You need to see what's going on. Because the challenge is that the liberties that we have, we didn't always live up to the liberties that we have in this country. In fact, if I was to describe myself, I'm politically in a lot of ways an MLK conservative. And his point was that his challenge to America was deeply rooted in the American principles, and we weren't living up to them. And I agree with that. That's the way to go about this. And that's what's actually being dismantled around our country today. So, interesting thing, with the 4 out of 5. How come we don't hear that? Because that doesn't seem to fit some narrative that's out there. And again, what we want, we understand on top of this that there are elected officials now who are standing down. They're not prosecuting felonies. That's what's happening in Illinois. That's what's happening in our major cities. People who are being arrested for felonies are literally walking in, being arraigned, and then walking out because there's no bail, and they're back out on the street. I mean, these are the things that are happening. And yet, when required, these police who are being defunded, dishonored, and degraded, they're still required to keep the bullies at bay. How does that work? Now, remember, we aren't dismissing the fact that there are rogue cops. Of course, there are bad folks in every institution in which we live. We're going to get to some of that when we get into the public school system in a minute, too. The facts, though, are that generally police are doing their job really well in America right now, and they're not hunting people down. That's the facts. That's the data. And again, you can find those kind of things in other places besides here. But again, those of us who do believe that we should limit government, and that means even limiting the police force's involvement in our lives, I could go for some of that discussion because we are going to tell them what we consent with them to do. If that is the case, then virtuous people must, and I mean by this, virtuous disciplining parents must stand up to fill that gap. Or tyrannical government or gangs are going to fill the void. So you can't have this public obliteration of the family and the obliteration of the police and then expect to be peace and justice in our neighborhoods. And that's where we're at today in these discussions. They're obliterating both marriage and family, and literally kids become almost wards of the state and a lot of progressive secular thinking. And then we obliterate the cops too, the police too. How can we do that? You can't do both. Actually, what you'll see is police doing the bidding more and more of constituents, and that's bad too, because we want police to do what we consent, all of us consent for them to do. And again, just a general Bible principle, bad guys should be afraid, and law-abiding citizens should live in relative peace and justice, and that is really what's going on. That's what's being challenged today. Another article that I read, and this one, for those of you, there's a lot going on with homeschooling right now, and parents are starting to realize, hey, maybe we can take back our children's schooling. I am noticing a lot of advertising now about public curriculum for homeschoolers. That's free. Actually, it's still paid for by your tax dollars. Nothing's free in this world. But, we who are representing parochial education and those of you in private education, boy, you should start pumping out good curricula because the public school system will try to fill that void. And I don't think homeschooling, I think the next war is going to be on homeschooling because, again, it's taking away the control that certain people want to have of the school system. If you don't believe what I'm saying here, again, there's that book about Get Out Now. That's a good book on what's happening in the public system. But here is an article where this is a teacher openly fretting on his Twitter feed. This is what he said. He said, this person was worried that conservative parents would be able to interfere with the messy work of indoctrinating children into critical race theory, gender theory, and other left-wing dogmas. And this person kept going on. He talked about what happens, we got to have this what happens here stays here kind of control of our classrooms. And he said, I'm intrigued by the helicopter snowplow parents, what they can do about these discussions about gender and sexuality. And the conservative parents, they're my chief concern. I know that damage can come from the left, but when we're engaged in the destabilizing of kids' racism, homophobia, transphobia, how much do we want these parents' ability to pile on? Now, he goes on to talk about this, and he says that a lot of the responses were aghast that this is what teachers thought they were doing to our children in the grade school classroom, but there were a lot of teachers saying, hey, we feel your pain. We know that that's going to be the issue. They don't want you to know what they're telling your kids. Now, again, three things this guy talks about. Classrooms are they're not safe spaces for the vulnerable. They are, you teach my child. I'm the one who actually creates safe space for my children, not you. And then second, an adult keeping a secret from a child, concealing that secret from the parents, especially when it comes to sexuality. What do we call that in other terms when an adult does that with children? We call that child abuse. When you drop your kids off for school, and then he said, finally, the point to be made here is public school teachers are supposed to be teachers, not parents, shamans, spiritual guides, therapists, friends, confidants, sex counselors, all rolled into one. And again, this goes to the idea of who actually has the authority in education. And those of us who are from a biblical worldview say, no, the parents have the authority to raise, to train, to discipline their children, and they may give some of that authority away. Even those of you who are talking about confirming your kids in the Christian faith, do you know that biblically you're supposed to be the one who teaches your child? The pastor's supposed to confirm your children in the faith, to see it, to examine them, see whether they've been taught. But the parents are the ones who are supposed to be the ones who teach their children the things that are valuable and important. This is an affront to that. The public system, as we see it now, sees themselves as taking your children away from that view of your role in their life. I read another article where it was a professor who talked about the joy of watching kids being dropped off at the university, and the parents were helping their children move into the dorms and putting stuff into the dorms for their kids, and then they were hugging and then they were leaving. And he said, good, because now they're mine. No, they're not. And so again, when you see these things, this idea that their job is to kind of like deprogram and reprogram, where did we sign up for that? So now there is an article, I love this, by Bill Federer. Bill Federer has kind of a American Minute publication that he puts out every day, and it's chock full of stuff. And so Federer's his name, Federer, and it's a good read. Gives a lot of information, that we don't often hear in our articles that are written about these kinds of things. Even some of the exposés I read, they don't have a lot of information that I need to know, and he does. This one, he was talking about prayer in school, and he was talking about the war on prayer in school. And by the way, I don't know if I would fight for prayer in public school as much as I would fight for school choice. I don't know that we're ever going to be able. The unions have lots of money. The unions have control. The unions are dominated by the Planned Parenthood ideology. They're dominated by the sexual orientation ideology. And they've got lots of cash because they've got your cash right up front. They already have it. That's my biggest thing about right now. They're even using the fact that they don't have to go back to work. They're going to get paid 100%. They don't have to go back to work, and they're pitting the children versus the parents about whether or not we can go back to school in COVID-19. If I'm a parent, I have control of where my child goes to school, and I have control of where the money that I have for education goes. I'll make that decision. And if there's some schools that can open up safely, I might take my child there. And that way I don't get involved in this discussion of parents and teachers and unions. I don't get involved in any of that. I take my child where I think my child will best be educated in safety, and I make that decision myself. Parental choice is one of the best things to fight for in all this racial stuff today and in all this economic stuff today, because if a child gets a great education, that's an equal access opportunity for success in this country. And parents have the responsibility, and I say the right, to actually determine where they take their money and where their child goes. And that is a big battle. And again, I ask people, why is it that one of the first things the Democrats do when they get into power is they shut down parental choice and they shut down charter schools, if they really care about poor people and equal access? That's another discussion. But anyway, on this one, he talked about kind of a secular movement that's been going on for over 100 years, and it was to eliminate prayer, control the schools, soften the curriculum, infiltrate the churches, discredit the Bible, discredit the American culture, discredit the family. And a lot of these were communist, socialist, secularists who were both in our culture and in our schools and around the world. And again, our kids today actually have this notion that socialism is going to be such a beautiful thing, and socialism always degenerates into tyranny, because socialism can only work if people are perfect, and we know people are sinful by nature, and that's why a representative republic is the best form of government, leaving that kind of self-rule to those who are religiously motivated, because once a tyrant gets in power who's just as bent as we are, they do what's in their best interests of all. So again, this secular movement's been around for a while, and it's in all of our institutions today, and it needs to be dealt with, because the Christian worldview is contrary to the secular worldview of life. And I read one more article, the U.S. Christians increasingly departing from the core truths of the Christian worldview. That stands to reason to me, because I don't know how you can give your kids over 8 hours a day to a secular system like we have now created, and then 1 hour of Sunday school and maybe 1 hour of a 20-minute sermon in church. If parents aren't actually teaching their kids and instructing their kids in the faith, this is what we're up against today. So we've got to take back some of these responsibilities in our lives. Another article that hit me, I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to wait. Remember, Reformation, restraint. Wait till all the facts are in. But we saw the knee on the neck of that one guy leaning on the neck of a toddler. And again, you're just like, this is crazy. And it was a black-white thing. Well, now there's evidently, I think in North Carolina, there is a crime that was committed this last week where a 5-year-old boy was shot by an adult guy. He was an African American. He'd been in prison before and all that. I don't know what that has to do with anything. I'll find out. But it's just the heinousness of the crime. He literally, in broad daylight, walked out. The 5-year-old's on his bike in front of his 2 sisters, and he put a gun to the child's head and shot the child. If that's not a hate crime, I don't know what is. And so, again, we'll wait to see what's going on, but that's a scary thing. And again, we'll see. And a lot of people have been arguing, too, about, the kind of violence that's happening to our children in the cities of Chicago and all these kinds of things. Yeah. Children are dying every day. Random bullets by gang warfare. This is another level of that. This is just out in the open, relatively peaceful day, and a child is targeted. So we'll see what's happening with that maybe by next time. All right, today, The Gathering Storm. I did read this book this week. Very good book, Albert Mohler Jr., The Gathering Storm, and it kind of talks about secularism's infiltration to our culture and what that means. It's interesting, as soon as you read something like this, then you'll see an article about how people are religious today, they're just not Christian. Well, secularism has to do with that. I think generally people are religious people, and I think secularism is in its own way a religion. Secular humanism, it was called before. It's a way of thinking that tries to organize one's idea. The only thing is that there's no God above you, so there's only the God within you. And so there's some religious forms of that. But the Christian religion is that there's a God above you. There's a morality above you. There are things that are objective to existence. There's a humanity and a dignity just because you're created in God's image. And the secularists are at war with that. They still are trying to tell us that they can hold on to individual dignity, individual rights, economic freedom. No, they can't. And you'll see that unravel pretty soon if the Christian worldview or the moral worldview gives way. This is a good book. It paints kind of the general stuff that's going on out there, and I think it's well written. I still like The Diversity Delusion by Heather McDonald as a compendium to this, because there's a lot of sociological data in here that undergirds his arguments as well. So good read, and we're going to talk about that, because I don't know if it's a gathering storm or if the storm is already here. We were in a huge storm a couple of days ago here at the house, and I was sitting in my car and I was looking, and there was a cloud that was coming. I mean, I could have reached up and touched it. It was that low. It was dark and dense, and it just seemed to be floating above my car. And I've got a convertible, so I was sitting in my convertible and the top was down. And I thought, I could see the line, the front coming through, and I thought, you know what? I don't see rain yet, but I better not wait till the very last minute. I think that's kind of the gathering storm. But I think the storm is here. The storm is here because of especially we'll talk about the Supreme Court cases again in the next few weeks. But they have literally brought that storm into our culture. And so the key for our engagement, I think, is religious liberty. I think that's where we can fight this battle without politicizing the gospel. But we have to fight for this. We have to contend for this. Because it's not a dialogue we're entering. This is a competition, a political competition, where one side has politicized everything and is now using the coercive powers of the state to actually silence opposing views. Well, we can't stand for that. Or we must stand against that so that we can keep our voice in the culture for the sake of the culture and the church. I read a poem by William Butler Yeats. It was written 100 years ago after the end of World War I. And if you want to talk about a destabilizing time in world history, listen to what he wrote, though. He said, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." And I'm pretty sure that's kind of what everybody felt, right? "The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best," now this is the line that got me, "the best," I guess he's saying the best of us, "lack all conviction, and the worst of us are full of passionate intensity." Boy, that's kind of that's a thought that it could go in almost every news article today. So before we talk now about that secular pietism that's morphing into this identity politics and what it's going to mean for our religious liberty, I just want to give you a couple of two kingdom principles, again, how to think through these things so that we're not going to solve everything politically, but there are some things we need to do for the sake of our ability to preach and teach the gospel without fear or coercion. First of all, the government is penultimate to God's ultimate work. Actually, the government is God's alien work, if you will. It's the least vital, important thing God wants done in the world. Proclaiming the good news of the gospel, the most important thing. Teaching the love of God, teaching the dignity of humanity, trying to get people to understand they were meant to be free and how to truly be free. That's what God wants. And the government does, its role is just to protect that from the bad folks who will not act decently in an outward fashion. So we call that the differentiation of church and state. Not the separation, because that implies that the Christian view is somehow private and this other stuff's public. Wrong. Differentiation. God is involved in the public work, in His public work of humanity, and His left-hand work. It's to preserve the world, and that's where we tend to find government, police, all that stuff. And then, of course, in the work of the church or in the organizations that are free, he's proclaiming that there's another kind of freedom. Ultimately, that freedom is best known and understood in the person and work of Jesus Christ by grace alone through faith for all. But even the yearning for that is supposed to be directed that way, not towards the state. The founding fathers understood this, but this is biblical. This is Jesus saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. So differentiate. Here's the problem. Most of you differentiate this by pulling it apart left and right. And I've heard people talk about, left and right. We got the crazies on the left and the crazies on the right. And so let me just tell you, and it tends to be that left-wing people, they don't always defend truth, but they love. And the right-wing people, they're always talking about truth, but they're not always very loving. Get all that nonsense out of your brain, because that is how you're being told how to think this through. And by the way, the Christian church is always considered a right-wing thing in that dialogue. So if you let people talk to you in this left-right bifurcation, you've already lost the argument, because they already think you believe in truth, and since there is no truth, you don't really love people, and that's how they caricature the church. No, the issue is not left and right, it's up and down. Up and down. The differentiation of church and state. The state's on the bottom. It has very limited things that it's supposed to do, and we tell it what to do, and we consent and give it those things and nothing more. We then take the responsibility of living free, self-disciplined, moral, virtuous lives for the sake of our families, our communities, and our church. Up and down. And the state, is the lowest thing we do. So I can argue with how we even want to limit cops' role, police's role in our lives. Sorry for using the word cops. Policemen's role in our lives. But what's happening is, so it's state on the bottom, free citizens on the top, and especially those who are motivated by the good news of Jesus for the sake of all. What's being done is they're turning that upside down, and they're putting the church and free individual people on the bottom, and they're putting the state on the top. So it's statism versus individual liberty. That's the issue. It's not left and right. There are right-wing views of statism, and there are left-wing views of statism. Hitler was a fascist statist, and Mao was a communist leftist. But they were both statists. They both believe the state has control over your lives and you don't have individual liberty. That's the issue. That's what we're fighting. So don't get caught in this left-right dichotomy. Don't do that, because it's meant to just put you on the right, and we've already debased the right in our public dialogues. So state encroachment in the areas of church, that's what the secularists are after, and everything then will become political. And we see that today. And we as Christians just have an innate understanding that that can't be right. Everything isn't political, and we get that. But we're not allowed to think that way today. And our children are actually being taught that everything is political today. So what you eat, what you drink, what you wear, what you drive, what you make, whom you worship, what you serve, what your ethics are, what your morals are, how you will live and how you will die. Abortion, euthanasia. Someday there are going to be panels just like school boards that tell you how you're going to live your final days of your life. If you don't think that's coming, well, it's kind of already here, because people in the nursing homes in the pandemic, they were living their lives, and then they saw people with communicable diseases being brought into their homes and maybe even put to beds next to them, and they didn't want that. They didn't have any control over that. The parents couldn't, or the children of those parents couldn't do anything about it. The churches couldn't do anything about it. And if you think you're going to sue the state to protect you at the end of your life, they'll be able to outlast you, because they already have all of your money. So when you think about these things, that's the issue for us. Even the issue for things like, health. See, it's not health care, it's health insurance. And then it's who has access to all that information about people. That's what the issue is for those of us who would rather create our own ability to take care of ourselves. We have our own insurance company for our church. We have our own investment companies in our church. I'd rather live that way of people, fending for themselves and caring for themselves. So again, when the government comes in and takes all those things, it usurps its role. It engages, it starts to get involved in the benevolencing areas of life that it was never meant to be a part of. And that's what's the issue for those of us who are fighting for religious liberty. not left or right. In fact, we don't think politics is going to save us from a lot of the challenges. So up and down, limited government, free citizens, or overarching tyrannical state, and citizens do what they're told. Identity politics is kind of the next wave of how to enforce this secularization. Because, see, identity politics ultimately roots your identity not in something objective. So right off the bat, identity politics is now rooted in something that you determine on your own terms. So it's not rooted in the fact that God created you. And if they do, that's lip service to that. That's just using that language as a cover to actually create more ambiguity, if you will, not clarity. But it's not in God. It's not in family. In fact, the family, again, you look at the Black Lives Matter, the identity politics, the feminist liberation theology, all those kind of things. The family is an enemy of identity politics, because we want you to have your own self-constructed identity, and then we want to somehow capitulate the state to actually coerce and enforce those identities. So identity politics, it's the new form. A lot of people are writing on this. I'll give you some articles from the Heritage Foundation that are good about this, but this is something I've studied for a long time. And when you start to see this, it's the new form of Marxism. It bifurcates America, and it actually destroys our ability to finally deal with one another on individual terms. Okay? So America, the identity is with the individual citizen with inalienable rights from God, guaranteed freedoms before the law. That person then is free to strive to maintain family, church, neighborhood, to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. And happiness there is a virtuous thing. It's not just I want to be happy kind of thing like it is today. It's not just an emotional thing. Secularism, there's a new identity, and you can construct it, and then you can put the state to work for the sake of your protection and even enforcing others to acquiesce to your view too. The latest machination is that your identity is your skin color, obviously, your position of privilege, or whether you're being persecuted, whether you're an oppressed person or an oppressor. And there's no nuance. And this is what I'm saying. There's no nuance for individualism, contextualism, character, virtue, and God forbid, God's identity, God's view of your identity. It's not allowed. And the state must balance not only the access, but the outcomes of all these things. Identity politics challenges the fundamental ideas of America, also fundamental things like the good news of the gospel as well. So no overarching narratives, no objective morals, no fundamental truths. And there are people who say that then there can be no fair government for all, there can be no justice for all, there can be no message of hope for all. So what do we say to that? What do we say to that? Well, first of all, our Two Kingdoms says, wait a minute, government is not that important, and it shouldn't be in charge of those kinds of issues. That's the first thing, Two Kingdoms. Government's on the bottom, free people on the top, and religiously free people in Christ, obviously. That's the Christian worldview. So we can say right off the bat, there's a certain truth that no overarching principle emanating from sinful people like us can bind us all together. It's actually very biblical, but it also then argues for a limited state, doesn't it? And there are two huge events in the Bible. One's the Tower of Babel, and the other one is Pentecost. Tower of Babel, God actually smashes our unity into tribalism and into different languages and things like that, so we can't actually talk to each other, and He does that for our protection, because sinful people who finally become of one voice, as sinners, what do? They ultimately destroy themselves. So God actually protected us by forcing us to learn how to deal with one another, because we can't seem to talk to one another, and we have to actually open our ears and eyes and serve before we try to help. So there is no overarching principle from sinful human beings that can finally bond us together like that. The only perfect thing that can bond us together is the person and work of Christ, and that's why in Pentecost you see all languages, cultures, and tribes coming and now being gathered around this one message, this one person. And in Revelation, all you see the picture of heaven gathered around that throne. That's the only thing. Identity politics says no. Even the message of Christ becomes a political thing. And it morphs into here and now and politics, not some other message besides the message of politics and secular pietism. That's its biggest challenge to us. Now, if there's only one message that can finally bond us together, then what about America? Well, America to me is the best of what's left. It's the best basement way of organizing ourselves so that we have outward freedom, liberty, and those things to the best of our ability as sinful people. And one of the reasons why is because the American founders actually took total depravity, man's sinfulness, seriously. Even their own, by the way. So America does protect these universal human rights, the freedom of every person to aspire to things because God created them. It also then took our depravity seriously and bound the coercive power of government. And it bound us from the tyrant, because that's what ultimately, the kind of the communist thing becomes one person or one party rule. It bound us, it protected us from that. It also protected us from the mob. Because the democracy of sinful people can be very destructive too. So constitutional republic, what a powerful thing. So what it's also is, it removes this kind of us and them nonsense that we're seeing in identity politics. There's a third group of people. The third group of people is that middle class of people who are able to now actually put their liberties to work. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So believing that there are higher principles than merely self-interest, there are fundamental moral truths, there are fundamental ideals that we all need to aspire to, even if we don't always live up to them. E pluribus unum, that's one of them. Inherent dignity of every human being because they're created in the image of God. Equal justice because there's a moralness and a justice above us that we all need to acquiesce to. And then this creation of this thing called the middle class, the mom and pops, the public arena that's not political. That's what makes America unique. And that's what's being rejected right now. So for those of you who are not even Christian, but you like the idea of being able to start your own business, you like the idea to be kind of a mom and pop who takes control of their families, who actually wants their families raised in the virtues that you think are important to make it in this life, if you are one of those people and you don't want the politics to engage any of that, that is what people are at war with. That's what the secular pietists are at war with. That's what the challenges are that are coming in these constitutional abuses of gay marriage or sexual orientation. All those are going to be they're going to be politically used to silence those who disagree. So identity politics is a way of challenging and defeating that. And so I got a quote here: those who traffic in unfair name calling don't want to unify Americans as a part of a shared history, a shared pursuit of justice, a shared economic prosperity. Identity politics stands diametrically opposed to e pluribus unum and therefore stands opposed to the values of the United States. So again, as we've talked about last time, secularism is the notion that I don't have anybody to answer to but myself. Identity politics then puts that into motion and then co-opts the state to become the coercive agent of this kind of Marxist way of thinking in new clothes. Okay, so statists, that's who we're fighting against, and there's a secular version of that, and they're using the identity of people as a hammer of how to actually destroy some foundational principles. So we saw some of this in the Black Lives Matter protests this last weekend. They went down Chicago's Miracle Mile. And they talked about America's, we're just stealing what was stolen from us, and they're just taking from the big corporations, and everybody's got insurance and all that kind of stuff. Again, that's not what I saw in the riots, the Watts riot, not the Watts riots, the Rodney King riots. That's not what I've seen in Detroit. I saw mom and pop stores. Ferguson, same thing. I saw mom and pop stores that literally were burned to the ground, that were ravaged, that were looted, and they couldn't come back. Because by the time the insurance stuff came to them, it was over with. Their foray into self-discipline, self-rule, and economic prosperity was done. And that's the thing that, America's 80%. It's those kind of things, mom and pops. of every tribe, every nation. Black middle class, other ethnic middle class businesses that are rising up in our country. That's who we should be standing for in the middle of all this nonsense. Equal access to education, equal opportunity for those kinds of things, and then law and order so that we can actually bring resources to our communities. So again, when we looked at all these kind of things, the secular pietism and the identity politics is at war with all the things I talked about today. So in closing, just this, some of the questions that we were asking at the beginning: why are secular statist movements a challenge to the public voice? Because they challenge the underlying notion that God has any role in our lives and in our rights and freedoms. They challenge objective morality, they challenge that, and they don't say that cannot be a part of any of our structures, our schools, our government, and eventually I think even our churches. They're going to come after even what we teach in church. Why is the morality of the Bible a voice the culture needs to hear now? Well, if there was ever a time to say there's a morality that's bigger than us, now is the time. So we need to defend thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. We need to defend those. We need to also defend the virtuous life. We need to defend the family for the sake of the culture. These are God's, God preserves the world, but then He actually uses the law to actually convict us even in our hearts that even that's not enough. But again, preserving the world is vital to His work, because it's hard to preach and teach the gospel when all hell is breaking loose in our cities and in our communities. If a mayor, I was just thinking about this, not de Blasio, but the one before, Bloomberg. If the mayor of New York can determine what size soft drink you must buy, I'll never forget that. He determined, he said, I'm going to make, all it did is made it harder for poor people to buy. If they wanted to buy a big gulp, which was cheaper, they now had to buy 2 smaller ones. So it just made it more expensive for poor people. That's what really happened. But when a mayor thinks that's my role in your life, that's government out of control. And we've got a lot of that kind of government today. Why state-centered secular pietism fails to empower. This is, again, my biggest issue, too. These liberation movements, and this is statistically demonstrable. There's a book, The Economics of Political Liberation by Anthony Bradley, a very good read. And it's, again, talking about how what actually happens with these statist movements is they don't empower people. If we decentralize education and bring educational choice to people, if we empower them in a virtuous way of living and self-disciplined way of living, delayed gratification, that will literally, and they get a high school education, they get married before they have children, and they stay married. That's the recipe for success. And, again, the state-centered stuff always makes people, it always destroys initiative, it destroys that self-actualization, that self-empowerment, and that's what we want to empower our neighborhoods, even if they don't join our church. So, again, a quote from Mike Gonzalez, Heritage Foundation: stated plainly, my goal is to change how the nation thinks about politics and identity groups. He said, the identity collectives have done nothing to alleviate the very racial discrimination and social justice that continues to exist, nor were they intended to. They only seek to exacerbate. We want to, with these principles, these left-hand kingdom principles of God, to even empower those who might disagree with us. But we want to serve them the way God actually serves us. And I do think the church can be a great voice in the middle of this, because we're a balanced voice. We don't expect the state to solve all our problems. We want to create public things which are not political, and that's what's being at war against right now. And then, of course, we want to be able to preach the gospel, which is the good news that no human being can bring to the world except Jesus Christ. So, religious liberty is our surest defense, and we're going to have to fight for it. And that's really the end of this discussion, is that the sexual pietism is another worldview. And I think the Christian worldview, especially the moral nature of the Christian worldview, which other people share with us, even if they're not Christian, the Judeo-Christian, but there are other movements in the world that have that same basic moral foundation. This needs to be contended for. We need to fight for this, and the best way to fight for this is to take on these religious liberty issues. That's why Supreme Court justices are so important. That's why the politics of the sanctity of life and those kind of things are so important, because they're fundamental issues that really create a civil society for every human being. So contend for the moral ordering of God's world for the sake of the culture. That's your role if you're a Christian, and the Bible defines what those moral truths are. Contend for liberty to share your faith without fear. That's what the American experiment gives to you and to me. It's really a blessing. Let's put it to work. So till we see Him face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. Have a great day.